Okay, well, welcome, Eileen. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing great. Thanks for having
Good.
me.
Of course, I'm really excited for our talk today. Before we start, though, I'm hoping you can introduce yourself to our listeners because they probably don't know you.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Eileen Devine, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I am the founder of Brain First Parenting. It's a coaching practice for parents that I have, parents who have kids with brains that work differently and really challenging, confusing, relentless behavioral
Mhm.
symptoms. I'm also the parent of two teenagers, my son Connell, who's a sophomore, and my daughter Maya, who's a freshman. Maya is the reason I found myself getting into this work about a
Mhm.
decade ago. She's 15 now, and we adopted her at birth, and she
Okay.
has significant brain-based differences. And so, in trying to figure out how to parent her in a way that didn't make things worse,
Yeah.
um, I decided to change the area of my clinical focus because I had been a social worker for a long time before that,
Okay. Okay.
and start working with families who found themselves in similar shoes. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the combination. And then I have my husband, Dave, who's wonderful. I don't want to forget him.
Yeah. And a dog.
And a dog, Finn. Yes.
What kind of dog is Finn?
We don't know. He was
Oh,
rescued from Iran of all places. That was
okay.
not our intent, but we think a little bit of hound because he's a talker, if you know what I
Okay.
mean by that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and his like nose to the ground all the time.
Oh.
Probably we figure like a mix of hound and lab, but he's a very sweet, sweet,
Oh.
sweet pup. So yeah,
So how old was he when you got him?
well, it's an interesting question because the rescue organization said he's a year and a half, and we've had dogs before. So I was
Yeah.
like, oh, that's perfect. Like,
Yeah.
that's a great age. And we got him, and I was like, this dog is not a year and a half.
Okay. So younger.
So, yeah, so we got the paperwork from Iran, and they had an estimated birth date that made him about 8 or 9 months. And I was like, okay, that
That makes
now it
sense.
makes sense. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
So he was 8 or 9 months. Yeah. And that was
Okay.
probably 4.5 years ago. So yeah.
Okay. And you survived the puppy stage.
Oh, we survived. Yeah. It
Oh,
was,
puppies are
yeah.
hard.
Yes, they're hard. It was in the middle of COVID, which I think probably
Okay.
helped in
Yeah.
that we were all home. We weren't
Yeah.
trying to like manage getting out of the house every day. And
Yep.
anyways, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We have a puppy. And so she
Oh,
is
you do.
9 months old. And mhm,
Okay.
yep.
Yeah. Yep.
She
Yep. You're in the
causes a
thick of it
lot
then.
of problems. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, we love her. So
Mm.
okay, well, before we start talking about like the meat of the stuff, I am
Yeah.
curious because you live in Portland and our
Yeah.
family goes to the Oregon coast. I live in
Oh,
Cheney, which is near Spokane, so I'm
okay.
on the
Yeah.
eastern Washington.
Yep.
But we go to the Oregon coast every year just for like a family vacation. And do
Mhm.
you, I'm curious because you live in Portland, like, do you go to the Oregon coast
Every
for
year,
you too?
every
Okay.
summer.
Where do
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
guys
Yeah.
go? Like, what is your favorite?
Manzanita.
Oh, we haven't done that one yet.
Oh, you have to do it.
Okay, I'm writing it down
You will
right
never go back.
now. Okay.
Where do you typically go?
Lincoln City, we've been
Okay.
to Rockaway Beach,
Okay. Yep.
Newport. So
Yep.
yeah, kind
Yeah.
of in
So
that area.
Manzanita is very different than those
Okay.
in that it's like very quaint, very sleepy, small town. So
Okay.
depending on what your family's looking for, I should
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
But it's got this like wonderful, lovely main street and a few restaurants.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a really, really beautiful place. And they also have a big state park nearby that
Okay.
has really nice trails for biking, like paved trails, or
Yeah.
for walking
Hiking.
too.
Yep.
Yeah,
Hmm.
in the Nehalem Bay is
Okay.
there. So yeah, we
Maybe we'll
try to
have
go
to
every
check that one
week,
out
every
next time.
summer, or every week. I wish
Yeah.
we try to go once a summer for about a week.
Okay. Yeah.
Mhm.
We typically go in the fall, but we're finding that as our kids are getting older, it's harder to do that because of activities.
Yep.
But it's cheaper in the fall.
Yes.
So
Yeah. And then you don't have to
um
book out like for a full week. That's often the
yeah.
requirement.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was just
Anyway.
out your way this past summer in Winthrop, Washington.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had a big family reunion there.
Oh,
So
fun.
yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway,
Mhm.
I just, because I know you were from Portland, I was like, I need to
Yeah.
ask her if,
Oh yeah.
like,
Yeah.
what
It's
are
a
we
really
missing out
popular
on?
destination. Yeah.
Okay.
For folks even
Okay.
in Portland. Real easy to
Love
get
it.
to too.
Okay. I'll try it because
Yeah.
I actually have not heard of Manzanita. So
Oh, check
I
it
will.
out.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let's talk now. I think
Okay.
my first question, because this is going to be kind of like the overarching theme, which is trauma, right?
Hmm.
So that's why we're here.
Hmm.
My question to you is, how do you define trauma? I know that that
Hmm.
is a buzzword that people are
Hmm.
using a lot these days, and I think it's overused and maybe used in the wrong way sometimes.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so I'm just curious from your perspective how you would define trauma.
Yeah. The way I would define it is an event or something that happens to someone in their life that shatters their sense of self and well-being.
Mm,
And not just kind of cracks it open, not just kind of shakes it a little bit, but completely shatters it. And um, I also think of it, I don't know if you've heard kind of the categorization of big traumas and small
yeah,
traumas,
yeah.
which was super helpful for me when I was kind of venturing down this road, really in service to the parents that I work with and trying to help, get a better sense of their parent experience. Was oftentimes they will say, I haven't experienced trauma.
Mm,
And I'm looking at them and saying, yeah, you do every day. Some of
yeah,
them at the
yeah,
hands of their kids, really,
yeah.
which is, and that is that small trauma, right? Like that just
Okay.
constant
Mhm.
toxic stress shattering their sense of self and security and well-being. But I think my experience has been that most people think of it as in the big traumas, right?
Yeah.
Some big life event, either a natural disaster
Hmm.
or like an assault or something like just terrible, awful one-time big event.
Hmm.
And so I think remembering that those small traumas are definite traumas as well.
Well, and if they're
Just
chronic too, if those small traumas are chronic and
that's right.
not just a one-time
That's
thing.
right. Right, right. Because the other piece that I think a lot about and talk a lot about is when you experience trauma, what does it do, of course, to your body, your mind, your
Hmm.
heart, your soul, and your nervous system being such a big piece of that. And if you are experiencing that chronic toxic stress every single day, your nervous system is going to get stuck in that fight or
Yeah.
flight response. It can't
Yeah.
help but to do that, right? I was just talking to a parent yesterday about how do we helping her understand that that's what she was describing, like she's stuck in
Mm,
that hypervigilant state, even though she knows she can cognitively say, I don't need to be there anymore. Like things are
hmm.
better. My child's doing better. But her body doesn't
Mm,
know. Her body
hmm.
doesn't trust, right? But that wasn't just a one-time event. It was several years of
Yeah.
this decompensation of her child and her family, really, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That was kind of a
Yeah.
tangent, but to
No,
your
that's
question.
well, and that kind of goes into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is that brain behavior connection,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
so if we are experiencing, whether it's a big T trauma, the
Hmm.
one, big thing, or some
Hmm.
some little T traumas, chronic,
Hmm.
this years of daily intrusiveness into our
Hmm.
nervous system, that does affect that brain behavior connection.
For sure.
And so I would love to hear you kind of talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, this is kind of what I do with parents because they have kids who some of the parents have kids that they don't know the histories, they don't know exactly what it is, like what is
Okay.
causing these behavioral um, challenges.
Hmm.
And so we're always going back to the brain. And it's important to know, of course, it's important to continue to go down that road and try to figure that out as best they can for medications, benefits, all
Yeah.
kinds of things. But in their parenting day to day, what we talk all the time about is that's not the pressing question. Like that you have a child whose behaviors are really out of bounds in
Hmm.
terms of what we expect from a child of that age or in this particular situation, right? They're not just being quote unquote a little difficult or
Hmm.
stubborn or it's more than that, right? And so you can assume that they have a brain that works differently. Now,
Mhm.
it may be trauma, it may not, we may not know, but behaviors and brain, they cannot be separated.
Sure. Yeah.
We can't ever separate them. And so, and we have science, of course, that tells us
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And so if we have a behavior that we're solely focused on, we're laser focused on it, what can I do to get it to stop? Because it's so distressing to us, to our family, that kind of thing. We have to bring the brain alongside that. It just makes sense since the two
Yeah.
aren't ever separated. And so that once that's the shift, right, which is really difficult to make, of course, when you're in the thick of it, but continuously shifting our focus back to what does this have to do with the brain? How has the brain been changed
Mm.
in really significant ways for
Yeah.
many individuals who experience trauma? And how can we accommodate, support, and heal? And so that, when we're a lot of times we're talking about kids, right, where that's happened, but for parents too.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like their emotional bandwidth, ability to regulate, their window of tolerance has like shrunk to
Shrunk.
this really
Hmm.
narrow place because of their trauma. And they're trying to parent a child who has the same
Hmm.
challenges because of the trauma, right?
Yeah.
So it's both sides and addressing both equally if they can, which is
Yeah.
the challenge. But
So is that where brain first parenting comes in?
yes,
Okay.
yeah, yeah,
So can you
exactly.
tell us about that? Like, what
Hmm.
is it? What does it look like? How do you use it in, your
Yeah.
sessions with the families you work with?
Yeah, sure. So brain first parenting really has those two sides of the coin. That's the way I talk about it. They're addressed equally. So what's happening with this child? How does their brain work differently than even a child of their same age and same diagnosis? There's still going to be
Okay.
unique aspects
Yeah.
of it. And that's like, well, what does our brain do for us? What assumptions do we make about what a child's brain does for them every day? What do we not even think about? Because if we're what society considers neurotypical, we probably have
Yeah.
never even thought about what our brain's doing for us every minute. So
Mm.
getting into that framework. And then from there, helping the parent dive into, okay, your child is struggling or lagging behind in this specific skill set, whether it's processing pace, cognitive flexibility,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
executive functioning,
Uh-huh.
all of those kinds of things. So then they can connect that to the behavior. Oh, I see when I ask my child to be flexible in this moment, they're not able to do it. They
Mm.
can't shift. They're so cognitively rigid. They can't see my perspective. So how do I help them ease into this alternative perspective, ease into this transition? They can't do it on their own, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Where a lot of times in traditional parenting, it's like, oh, come on, what are you making such a big deal about?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
you're too old to be throwing this kind of fit. Let's move
Mm-hmm.
on, right? They
Mm-hmm.
can't. They would be doing better if they could. And
Mm-hmm.
there's something to be curious about. The other half of that, the other side of the coin is the parent experience, which I always joke that parents come to see me because their child's very challenging and they don't know what else to do. They never come to see me because they're struggling.
Yeah.
But what
But
they
that's
find out,
the,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, we can only get so far in talking about their child. And if they don't start looking inward
Yeah.
and really fully, I don't know, it's acceptance, it's reflection, it's all kinds of things, but really taking a look at how this parenting experience has impacted them
Mm-hmm.
and what they need to do to build their resiliency, heal their nervous system, they're not going to get as far as they can
Mm-hmm.
otherwise with their child. So it's kind of these two different pieces. But it really came out of trying to understand my daughter Maya, who,
Mm-hmm.
as I shared, we adopted her at birth. She has a diagnosis of fetal alcohol.
Okay.
Um, I knew cognitively what that meant, but I had no idea what it
Yeah.
meant in our day-to-day parenting of her. And that those very good parenting techniques that we were using for our son, who is
Sure.
our biological
Yeah.
child, and what society would consider as neurotypical as they
Mm-hmm.
come, they weren't working for her. They were
Mm-hmm.
actually making things
Worse.
worse. Her
Mm.
behaviors were intensifying, escalating.
Mm.
And we're like, what is like we know what we're doing. What's
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
what's going on? So that led me on a journey to figure that out. And like I said, once I figured it out, I was like, man, this was life changing for her, for our family.
Mhm.
I delight in parenting her. She is a joy to be with, truly. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean every day's sunshine and rainbows, but
Right.
overall, that is truly how I feel about being her parent. And that would not have been the case if
Mm.
I didn't have this information that I didn't even know I was missing. So
Mhm.
that's why I wanted to be able to help other parents find this information, not have to work so hard to
Yeah.
get it.
Yeah.
So I meet with parents individually to just talk to them about both those sides of the coin,
Okay.
but I also have communities bringing parents together because it's so
Okay.
isolating. They feel so alone and like nobody would
Yeah.
understand what my day-to-day is like. I'm like, "Oh yeah, they would."
Yeah.
There's a lot of parents like that out there. So,
Yeah.
opportunities to bring them together, and I do lots of trainings and stuff like that too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so I am curious, did your daughter have her diagnosis before you started down this path of like, how do we change this? Or was it the other way around?
She did.
Okay.
So because we had confirmed use from birth mom,
Okay.
and she also had the facial characteristics. I don't know
Hmm.
if you're familiar with kind of the diagnostic criteria.
Yeah.
So both of those really hard to get for a lot of families, right?
Yeah.
The history confirmation, but also the facial characteristics aren't needed, but they're not always there to
Yeah.
make the diagnosis clear, right? So she got a diagnosis before she was 3,
Oh,
and I
okay.
had
Okay.
0 idea at the time how unusual
That
that
is.
is. I know
Hmm.
now, right?
Hmm.
And when her developmental pediatrician gave us this diagnosis, she passed on the name of Diane Malbin, who I don't know if you're familiar with her or not. She wrote the book Trying Differently Rather Than Harder,
Okay.
and she's in retirement now, but she is very well known for supporting parents of kids with FASD specifically. So that she actually lives very close to us, just
Oh,
happened to be
okay.
that way. I went to one
Hmm.
of her trainings, and that's when that shift happened.
Okay.
Um, so yes, we had the diagnosis, but I don't know. I mean, that led me to Diane, so that was, of course,
Hmm.
instrumental. But it still didn't give me a whole lot of like, well, then this is what you do. Like most of
Hmm.
what we read about, and I'm guessing a lot of parents with that diagnosis or even trauma similar shoes, it's like, well, loving, caring home is environment.
Mm.
You need to create structure. You need to be consistent.
Yeah.
All of that's true.
Yeah. But
But I was like,
yeah.
okay, we've got all those pieces in place and it's
Yeah.
still not
Not
working.
working. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah,
Okay.
that wasn't as helpful as we hoped it would be.
Right. Yeah. Well, can you go back a little bit because
Yeah.
I am more familiar with I mean I'm not an expert and I know probably this much compared to what you know about
Yeah.
FASD, but I
Mhm.
my listeners may not know what
Oh, okay.
is FASD and
Hmm.
how does someone get a diagnosis. So can you
Hmm.
kind of just walk through that?
Yeah. So FASD is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And it is, of course, caused by mom drinking while pregnant.
Mhm.
Um, it is much more prevalent than most people think. There's estimates that 1 in every 20 to 22 kids in the US
Wow.
have FASD. As you might imagine, there's a lot of stigma
Mhm.
around that diagnosis. And so um, the right questions rarely get asked
Mhm.
by pediatricians when kids are struggling. And so, for example, with my daughter's Black. Her parents are very poor and uneducated, her birth parents. Um, they were quick to ask them all those questions.
Mm. Mhm.
If myself or,
Mhm.
someone in my kind of demographic had a child with similar challenges, I'm not sure they would ask those
Right.
questions.
Yeah.
They probably ADHD is a very common misdiagnosis.
Yeah.
The symptoms of ADHD align almost perfectly with FASD.
Yeah.
So that's often a common misdiagnosis. Autism is another one, but ADHD is higher. FASD is a spectrum. And so we talk about it as an invisible disability of the brain for
Mhm.
many of these kids. So my daughter is pretty severely impacted. Her birth mom drank heavily throughout her pregnancy.
Mm.
So it doesn't take much time with Maya to understand, like, oh, there's differences here.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
Right? Um, I mean, a 15-year-old carrying around her stuffed animal,
yeah,
things
yeah.
like that. But that's not typically the case. There's a lot of, just like ADHD, there's a lot of people impacted by FASD who appear to be challenging behaviorally, like, oh, they don't listen, they're not motivated,
Mm.
they don't care, they don't
Mhm.
think about anybody else but themselves, those kinds of things. They're
Mhm.
manipulative, right? They're lazy.
Mm.
When in fact, they don't have the skills that we assume they do to navigate their day. So they're
Yeah,
set up for failure every
yeah,
single day, when really what they need is accommodations. So those kids, I think, are at most risk for being misunderstood when they're at that specific place on this spectrum.
yeah,
Um, it's a permanent disability.
yeah,
So, I think of it as like a traumatic brain injury, right? The brain has been damaged. That we talk a lot about neuroplasticity.
yeah,
Neuroplasticity in the way that most people understand it does not apply to kids with FASD. And there's lots of research and reasons why that is, but I think
yeah,
that's an important thing to mention because a lot of parents are like, well, what about neuroplasticity? Will the brain heal
yeah,
itself? When will this be done? When will she
yeah.
catch up? When will
Oh,
they recover?
yeah.
Right? So when I'm working with parents, that's a lot of the easing into the acceptance of what is.
Mhm.
Your life can have meaning and be beautiful and full of joy, and so can your child's. And also, their disability is permanent.
Yeah,
Like, there's some pieces of acceptance that have to happen so that they can be fully accommodated for the
yeah,
remainder of their life in the way
right.
that they need to be. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, does that help?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I know what your answer is gonna be, but do you think it's helpful to have a diagnosis of FASD, or is that
Mhm.
just one more label that we're putting on our kids?
No, I think it's
Okay.
absolutely helpful. And it's interesting. Labels are interesting, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you could say that about almost any
Yeah.
diagnosis, like, what does this label mean for my child? And I think a lot of that meaning we create it for our
Yeah.
kids. Of course, society has their own expectations, and we're always fighting against those and advocating for our child. But like my daughter, even with her significant delays and intellectual, challenges, she knows why her brain works differently.
Mm.
She knows what it's called.
Yeah.
She knows that there are days where she's having a really hard time, but she's not the problem. She's
Yeah.
not intentionally giving people a hard
Oh,
time.
that's good.
And so
Yeah.
that piece of self-awareness, I mean, I
Mhm.
think that's what kids start to believe is if we
Mhm.
don't have a diagnosis and we don't know what to call it and how to make sense of it, then our kids won't either.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they think they are the problem
Yeah.
when really they have a very serious physical disability that needs accommodations. It's such a different viewpoint. But I also think when we talk about stigma and treatment, and then it, of course, gets into these higher levels of just resource allocation and all of that kind of stuff, we have to talk about it. And we need
Yeah.
parents who have kids with this disability and live it every day to be the voices saying, this is what we need.
Yeah.
This is what our kids deserve. I mean, you think about how much we hear about autism
Yeah.
and autism awareness, and that's wonderful.
Yeah.
They need that too.
Mhm.
And also,
Yeah.
there's estimates that FASD is 3 times as prevalent.
Oh, wow.
But
Yeah.
the resource allocation is not there
Yeah.
because even from a political standpoint, it gets kind of tricky, right? So that's a long way of saying, like, we just have such a fickle relationship with alcohol in our
Yeah.
society. That's a long way of saying that I think it is. There's getting a diagnosis is so important for so many reasons. Another great example is ADHD, and the medications that
Mhm.
address ADHD don't work for those same symptoms for
Sure.
FASD,
Yeah.
right? So again, that's one just really concrete reason why sifting through that and getting the correct diagnosis is so important.
Yeah. You mentioned that we need to know that do we have to have proof that mom drank during pregnancy in order to get a diagnosis?
Yes,
Yeah.
for the most part. There's a
Mhm.
lot of conversation and um, varying opinions about whether that should be required or not.
Yeah.
So, but right now, to get a official diagnosis, you do need to have that report. So you'll hear a lot of parents talk about suspected
Yeah.
FASD,
Yeah.
right? Um, and that's kind of as far as they can go. Or there's substance use other than alcohol that they know about and they have
Yeah.
that confirmed. Well, we know
Yeah.
that most women are polysubstance users,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
So there's just logical assumptions or safe assumptions, I should say, you can make about that. And of course, other substances impact the brain
Mhm.
as well. Alcohol is the most severe.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. So if someone, is sitting here listening and they're like, "Well,
Mhm.
my child's birth mom told me that she drank, but I don't have any proof of that."
Oh,
What
that's
do
the
they
proof.
do with that? That's the
That's the
proof.
proof. Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. Yeah,
Okay.
great question. So that's what most so in this case we're talking about adoptive parents. What most
Yeah.
adoptive parents are asked is, do you have proof that birth mom drank? And her telling you,
Is
reporting that to you
Mhm.
is that proof,
Okay.
right? There's no other
Yeah.
documentation or anything like that that's needed.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where would somebody go if they're like,
Oof.
"Oh, wow, this sounds like our situation." Where do they
Mhm.
go? How do they get help?
Yeah. So a great place to start is FASD United,
Okay.
and that's the US basically advocacy group for FASD services. And on their website, they have a state by state directory. And so
Okay.
for Oregon, for example, you'll see my name listed there. So it's providers that have expertise in FASD, but it's also lists treatment centers
Okay.
for moms,
Mhm.
and it also lists diagnostic clinics.
Okay.
And what you'll find if you went through that and looked at a few states side by side comparison, it is drastically different from state to
Yeah.
state.
Yeah.
So here in Oregon, we don't have much in the way of diagnostic clinics.
Mhm.
We have a little bit, but not much. But Washington,
Yeah,
right
we
over the
do.
bridge,
Yeah.
you all do. You have a lot of resources, right? The
Mhm.
University of Washington, Wonderland, Hope Rising Clinic, all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yep.
So it does vary greatly from state to
State to
state, but that
state.
would be a great place for any parents who are, um, yeah, wanting to explore that to look.
Yeah. Okay. What about those individuals that, know maybe it's my niece or maybe it's my neighbor and I know like that's what this family is dealing with. How do we support those in our lives
Mm,
that are raising kids with that diagnosis?
yeah. Um, ask them what they need.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
mean, it would honestly, it would be, I would imagine, very similar to what maybe the parents listening in are most familiar with of like when you're parenting a child who has experienced trauma,
Yep.
what do you need?
Yeah.
Right. And that space to be able to be truly seen and heard
Mhm.
and have your experience recognized for what it is and to offer respite,
Yeah.
even just an hour at a time. I mean, I meet with all my parents virtually, and the reason for that, many of them are around the country or the world, but even those who are local, they can't find anyone
Anybody.
to,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, like my 15-year-old, she can't stay home by herself, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's not an option for them to make it. Anyways, respite is such a huge, huge need.
Yeah.
Um, but because our society is so entrenched in a behavioral lens,
Yeah.
right? They're like this behavior is willful, it's
Yeah.
defiant, this child is in full control. They're trying
Manipulative.
to, yeah, they're trying
Yeah.
to manipulate you.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, now they've really done it.
Yeah.
And you've
Yeah.
let them, right? There's
Yeah.
so much judgment against the parents.
Mhm.
Um, it takes a bit for people to shift their lens and just to even know that there's an alternative perspective out there that is, of course, supported by science and all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. And I always say to parents, like with those friends and relatives, you know, if there's an openness there, I think it's worth your time and energy.
Mm.
And just remembering my own trajectory, and it took a while for me to shift, like to give people grace and
Yeah.
understand that's what it takes. And also, some people can't do it.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
so hard,
Mhm.
especially when it's someone we care deeply about, right? Um, and then it's about conserving your precious energy. And is your child safe with this person if they continuously see them as a problem versus having a need for this really
Right. Yeah.
intensive support? But anyways, back to your question of what can people do to support others, I really do think it is that openness and
Mhm.
willingness to concretely do something to help, whether it's spending time with them and listening or taking their child for an hour, asking them
Mhm.
what they need. Um, it's all of those things.
Do you think it's beneficial, especially if it's like grandma who is in this child's life a lot, right? Do you think it's beneficial for people on the outside to learn more about what it is and about the brain behavior connection?
Mhm. I don't think it's just beneficial. I really do believe it's essential.
Yeah.
And, you know, I liken it to a child who has diabetes.
Hmm.
So diabetes is something that's not working as we would expect to in the body. And there needs to be some vigilance and accommodations and understanding by all the adults in any environment that that child's in. And you would never send your child who has diabetes over to grandma's house and not give her, like, this is what you do
Yeah.
at what time. If you see this, this is how you need to change and be
Yeah.
flexible and provide them with something different. We would never think of it because
Yeah.
it puts that child in harm's way.
Hmm.
The absolute same situation for our kids who have brain-based differences. The brain's a
Hmm.
part of our body. It's been changed for them in function structure. There's a different understanding that needs to come because of that physical disability.
Yeah.
And when that doesn't happen, they are distressed. And we see that distress through their challenging behaviors,
Yeah.
right? And so, absolutely, I don't think it's just a recommendation. I think it's really, really essential.
Yeah. Do you offer stuff, like trainings or classes for those who are not raising a child?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I do lots of trainings for I concerned community members or interested
Okay.
community members is how
Yeah.
I categorize it. And it's usually the same trainings I do for parents,
Okay.
other therapists, teachers, that sort of thing. There's also, I mean, if this is resonating with anyone who's listening, on my website are a few dozen at least blog posts.
Okay.
And many of those have been helpful for parents to give to family members to help them bridge that gap in
Sure. Yeah.
understanding. And one really funny story about that. There's a blog post on there called "My Child Ruins Everything" or
Okay.
"You Ruin Everything," something like
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
And I had a mom who, because that's what people think
Yeah. Yeah.
about these
Yeah.
kids. And it talked about shifting that lens. Your child
Yeah.
isn't ruining everything. They're in pain and distress. How do we
Mhm.
get them out of that state and support them differently? And a mom was like, she emailed me and said, "You are talking about my child. This is how they're viewed. This is my experience exactly. I really want to give this to my family so they can hear this perspective, but do you think you might change the title? It's
Oh, no.
kind of it's kind of harsh."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Yeah, it's harsh for a reason.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
right. It's so harsh and it's
Yeah.
so unfair, but that's exactly what enters into the mind of
Absolutely.
people who don't understand." So,
Yep.
thank you for your
I know,
thoughts.
right? But
I'm gonna keep the title as it
Yep.
is.
Yeah.
So, but there's also, related to this conversation, there's also one there, called "What I Wish My Family Members Knew,"
Okay.
something like that,
Yeah.
that a lot of parents have found helpful in just giving that to their family and saying,
Okay.
like, "Here's what I
Yeah.
would love for you to know about my experience,"
Yeah.
so that might be helpful too.
Okay.
Mhm.
I'll make sure that I link all of this in the show notes too, so people won't
Okay,
have to go searching for it. They can just come to
okay.
the one spot and find all
Mhm.
of your amazing information. So I'll do
Okay,
that.
okay.
Um, I just have 2 more questions left. I feel like this time went by way too fast, but it always does. So we just have 2 more things. The first
Yeah.
question I wanna ask because, I think just the reality is when we are talking about kiddos who have a diagnosis on the spectrum, FASD,
Mhm,
um, most likely they've been adopted. Is that
mhm.
fair?
Um, if they have the diagnosis, most
Yes,
likely they've been
they've been
adopted, yes.
adopted. Thank you. That is
Yep,
better
yep.
put than I did. And so my question for you is, what do you wish more people thought of when it comes to adoption? Like people who
Hmm,
are on the outside looking in, what do you wish more people thought of?
hmm. I think what I wish more people knew was that there is no adoption without loss,
Yeah.
that the two can't be separated.
Mhm.
Because the dominant narrative, I think, in our culture is adoption's wonderful. It's
Yeah.
happy. It's a win-win-win situation for everybody in the adoption constellation.
Yeah.
um, and that's it can be all of that, and also it contains loss.
Yeah.
And um, yeah, and so if you follow that out, what that means for each person in that constellation, for birth mom and birth dad, for the
Mhm.
adoptee, for the adoptive parents,
Mhm.
then it leads you to where the awareness and the education needs to be. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah,
Right,
absolutely.
right. Um, and so I think it's, yeah, preparing adoptive parents for what that loss looks like with their child,
Yeah.
even a child who was adopted on day one, like my daughter Maya,
Yeah.
right? There's so
Yeah.
much loss there for her still.
Yeah.
And what does that look like? What is the prevalence of things like neurobehavioral conditions,
Yeah.
FASD and others in the adoptee population? Like
Yeah.
saying that up front to parents.
Mhm.
And then if that happens to be the case, you know what to look for. You
Mhm.
know, you're not like, "Oh my gosh, what's this? What?"
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
we've been loving this child as much as any parent could love their child. Why are they struggling? Why are we having these problems?
yeah,
Like, they don't feel like,
that
you
shock
know,
to the
that's right.
yeah,
That's right. Because chances are, when
mhm,
you look at especially foster to adopt,
yeah,
that child has been impacted in lots of ways, right?
yeah,
So I think it sets parents up um, for failure, honestly, if they aren't prepared ahead of time, like in the pre-adoption education
yeah,
about
yeah,
what things might look like. And not this doom and gloom. That's not at all what I'm
right,
saying. It's this could be what your child and what your family comes face to face with. And also, there are things that you can do about it.
yeah,
You can thrive in that
yeah,
experience. That's absolutely possible. But oftentimes parents get to a point of they're in burnout,
yeah,
barely surviving.
mhm,
And so then they find what they need and they have to come out of that burnout. It's just such a longer path
yeah,
to that thriving, right? And there's resentment and all that stuff that has to be worked through. So
mhm,
it's
as
probably a
opposed to,
really
like,
long way to
having
answer.
no, you're good. So, like, what I think I hear you saying is, how can we change that narrative in society to, let's educate and help people see the reality of what adoption is instead of
That's
just
right.
this pretty little package with a tied up with a neat bow, which it isn't.
That's
um,
right.
and so if we can change that narrative, that can help people who because I'm a parent coach as well, and I see this a lot where I'm there because they are now in the middle of this tornado and they don't know
That's
how to
right.
get out.
Yep, exactly.
Where if we can get it ahead of time and
That's
help
right.
them do this, like
Mhm,
learning more about their kids and adoption and what
mhm.
what it means to stay connected with birth family, what it means to help our
That's right.
kids know their true selves, then maybe we won't even get to the tornado.
That's right. Absolutely, 1,000%. And, on that, kind of following that, what I would encourage parents to do is find adoptees who are the voice for adoptees in this space, whether it's social media, I mean, that's the main place where you hear a
Mhm.
lot of them, and listen to them.
Yeah.
They will tell you,
Yeah.
right? And wonderful if even potential adoptive parents could start listening to adoptees and hearing that voice, because they really should be the ones leading,
Yeah.
right? And so we
That's
think
good.
about that a lot, like with my daughter. Sometimes she's leading to a place where I'm really uncomfortable. I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't want to go into this again,
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm the parent and
Yeah.
she's leading me, like, that's our roles, right? So I need to kind of get through my emotional turmoil, whatever it might be. I need to do
Mhm.
my work
Mhm.
so that I can show up in the way that she needs me to
Mhm.
in her, experience as an adopted child.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay, so last question. What would be
okay.
three resources that you would recommend to
Mm.
families who are moving down a path of healing and growth, um,
Ooh,
especially in this new year?
yeah, yeah. Um, Man, okay. So I think for my I don't know if you are familiar with Robin Goebel.
Yes.
Okay, so she's a very good friend of mine,
Oh, I love
and
that for
she
you. I'm slightly jealous.
I'll tell her you said that.
Okay.
I'm talking with her on Monday. Yeah, so she
Oh,
just had a new book come out,
yeah.
Break Athlete Behaviors, and
Yeah. So
and
good.
oh, it's wonderful.
Hmm.
Yeah, so for this parent audience especially, I just think, that would be
Okay.
wonderful resource. For parents of kids with FASD or
Hmm.
suspected FASD, I think Diane Malden's book, Trying Differently Rather Than Harder,
Okay.
it's such a good place to start. It's really simple, short, straightforward, but it kind of will launch you to on a path, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You that you need to be.
Okay.
And I also think, I'm trying to think of, like, there's a podcast series called A Little Easier by
Okay.
Kendra Wild, and it's a limited podcast series. And
Okay.
I was one of many, many guests on there that are like all much more renowned and have a lot more experience and expertise than I do. But it's all about the parent experience when you have a child that has pretty intense needs. It's
Okay.
so well done. So yeah, that would be kind of the parent experience piece of it. I would recommend that.
Do you know if that is like on Apple Podcasts
Mhm.
or it is?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I
Mhm.
will link that in the all of the in the
Yeah.
show notes too then. Cool. Okay, awesome. Well, I really have enjoyed talking to you.
Likewise.
I feel like I could pick your brain some more. So maybe we'll have to do this again another time.
Yeah,
No.
I'd love to. Yeah, come back anytime.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time
Mm.
and yeah, just have enjoyed our talk. So
Yeah, thanks for having me.
yeah,
Okay,
enjoy
take
your
care.
day. Okay.
Thanks, you too. Bye
Uh-huh.
bye.
Bye.